Yeah, boy.
Think fast, Chuckle Nuts!
So if you're not familiar with my older uploads, I made a video a couple of months ago about the disastrous Campaign Evolved announcement. Judging by the gameplay and needlessly obsessing over giving it modern updates, it was looking less like Halo and more like a poorly made copy of Destiny. And I was far from the only person who noticed the problems. Everything they were doing here to improve it for modern gaming standards just didn't feel like a Halo game, with the sprinting being the most egregious thing for a lot of people. Yes, there was footage of Spartans sprinting in the original games and even the original Halo 3 trailer, but that was to show how powerful Spartans were compared to regular soldiers. It was never meant to be a gameplay exploit. Adding this just breaks the traditional pace of the game and turns it into something more generic. And that's not including the other problems with this remake. Soulless voice acting, boring prequel missions, puny sounding grenades, slower cutscenes, exploits that took away from the design philosophy, enemy AI feeling less detailed, the original aesthetic being replaced by flashy shit and distracting lighting, generalizing enemy encounters, sloppy difficulty balance, regenerative health that completely removes the urgency in the heat of combat. These are things that many critics of the game have gone over already. I wasn't really gonna make a video on these things because I knew they were gonna shit the bed from the gameplay announcement. They changed so many fundamental things from the original formula for no reason, presumably to justify people buying this game when you already have the most perfect and definitive way to play it with the Master Chief Collection on Steam. So instead of talking about a whole bunch of stuff people have already talked about, I wanted to hyper-focus on a single element that I personally was dreading how they would handle it from the second I finished the trailer. But before I talk about that, let's rewind a little bit. On my old channel, I detailed how Halo isn't simply one of the greatest shooters of all time. It is one of the single greatest video games ever made. It wasn't just groundbreaking for its time. It reinvented an entire genre of game design with its incredible ingenuity and control scheme. Every single button on the original Xbox controller served a strategic and functional purpose, and you were tested to use all of them. Its level design was timeless, with everything meticulously put together to provide you with an unforgettable atmosphere and series of challenges. Its music was spectacular, with a tone that perfectly captured the gravitas of its world, but it also had a gripping story at its core. On a surface level, it's just humans fighting aliens in a sci-fi future, but it eventually evolves into something greater, thanks in large part to one of the single greatest levels in video game history, 343 Guilty Spark. We've all seen those memes regarding scary moments in family-friendly video games, but 343 Guilty Spark took it to a whole new level. It transformed Halo from a sci-fi action-adventure into a survival horror experience rooted in so many clever and unsuspecting techniques used to scare you in every corner, from the atmosphere to the overwhelming feeling of being trapped with a nightmarish enemy in the form of the Flood. It fills you with a sense of dread and catches you off guard with how brilliantly it lures you into a false sense of security, providing you with a really scary experience in a game that you wouldn't expect to be scary. It was the turning point for the original Halo, in which it turns into a timeless masterpiece that critically handles atmosphere in its favor. And of course, this remake was not on the road to faithfully adapting this level. I played this level on Steam right before I looked up the gameplay of the remake for comparison, and I really don't recommend doing that because it's gonna make the sour taste even more bitter as you see what they did to it. Now, if you're worried about anything missing or being cut out, the good news is that important details from the original are carried over here. The creepy radio transmission warning of a new hostile that is in Covenant, being able to see shadowy figures of the Flood from a distance, blood in the elevator when riding down, the barricades across the temple showing how the Covenant were trying to keep the Flood out in a panic, the bodies of a human soldier and a jackal next to each other showing how they made a temporary alliance against the Flood, downed Covenant gunships, faint growling noises while exploring the forest, ripped up Covenant bodies while exploring the temple, the hysterical Marine who lost his mind, the one elevator that explodes if you try to escape, and all these little demonstrations of the Flood being intelligent and how they stalk their prey and fill them with a sense of dread, making it easier to kill them. These are things that OG players would recognize and be familiar with to help keep the level more traditional. They also add a few new details like the Flood mass infecting the structure of the building to highlight how it's like an infection and not just a form of alien life. So on a surface level, there's nothing to worry about. All these creepy details that were important to making the level scary are included. But as we learned from Moana 2026, just because it does the same stuff as the original doesn't mean it's good. The first major drawback is how they removed the fog, or at least made the fog thinner. Maybe I didn't bring this up the first time, but the fog was a very important detail and a crucial element for the survival horror approach they were going for. The fog helped conceal a lot of the atmosphere to make it more unique and give the level a unique identity. It was just enough to blur out things from a distance while allowing you to see where you were going. It was integral to the experience as it it really looked like Bungie was using every trick in the book to terrify you. It added tension because you were uncertain of what was lurking in the mist. It blanketed everything in a sense of lifelessness that was haunting. But in Campaign Devolved, they made it so you can more easily make out things through the fog. It's no longer doing anything to conceal the dangers lurking around the forest. It's just a mildly annoying haze. It was supposed to give you a feeling of anxiety as you navigate the area while seeing the Covenant cower in fear. Now it just feels like a generic filter. Now exploring the forest feels less ominous. They deliberately made it less effective in favor of showing how powerful modern consoles are with how shiny and photorealistic the graphics are. And as you explore the forest, you notice they removed the yellow dots on the radar that were supposed to confuse the player. The Flood were able to disguise themselves as allies after taking control of their bodies, making you think there were Marines fighting the Covenant and throwing you off. It's one of the things that made the Flood scary and tactical. They were able to hide in plain sight and lure you into a false sense of security. But in the remake, this detail was completely forgotten about. Not to mention how the newer cutscenes make it less interesting. The cutscenes in the original had a really even pace to them. Nothing was done to stall or needlessly drag out what was happening. This let the developers focus on the build-up and atmosphere before you encounter the Flood, with the Master Chief carefully observing the room. It's simple and to the point as it conveys everything the player needs to understand the situation. In comparison, the pacing of the remake cutscene feels off. It awkwardly drags out the scene where Chief is entering and observing the room while watching the recording of a dead soldier, which is not a good thing because it distracts the player with how obviously slower everything is. It doesn't make the scene creepier to make it slower. It just makes it more cliché and predictable while wasting your time, especially if you're already familiar with what happens during this scene. Pacing is a very important element in a horror story because it determines how the viewer is going to react to what they're watching. And if the pacing is too slow, it makes the build-up more predictable. Like, just stop stalling already. We know you're building up to a shitty jump scare. The lack of subtlety due to how they slowed everything down makes the steady reveal of the Flood less impactful, and it just narrows out the suspense of the cutscene. But the worst thing about how Halo Studios adapted this level is how they did the exact same thing that Halo Anniversary did. And that's how they added all sorts of bullshit lighting and illumination scattered across the level. The most important factor that made 343 Guilty Spark scary was its use of total darkness, both in the forest and the Forerunner structure. It was somber and intentionally desaturated to contrast the more upbeat tone the game had up to that point. To this day, the use of low lights and shadows is a testament to why this level looks and feels the way it does. It was meant to be an authentic horror experience, one that shifted the game's gears in a way that completely transformed the nature of Halo Combat Evolved into something bigger. The clarity was meant to be scarce as a tool to intimidate the player. It was cold and foreboding to help you steadily realize something was wrong. The dim, swampy colors of everything was a brilliant color palette that fits the aesthetic of the Flood, and how they were a living parasite that infected everything around them. The moody approach made the darkness and shadows feel natural, and something that was actually serving a narrative purpose instead of just making it harder for the player to see. It was ingenious how they incorporated these elements into the world to make this level immersive and authentic, to make the horror feel so real. And how did Halo Studios handle this? Why, by doing the exact opposite, of course. Everything from the forest to the Forerunner structure has a whole bunch of unneeded lighting and bright hues that actively remove the intimidation of the atmosphere. Why are there so many unneeded lights in this level? The lighting on the trees, all these glowing hues inside the structure, all these bright illuminations in a level that's supposed to be dark and desaturated to create a scary atmosphere, all of these out-of-place oranges and reds and light blues and whites that completely ruin the game's original art style. It completely kills the intimidation and sense of fear you're supposed to feel from the Flood. There's no sense of dread like with the original game now. Why do they keep doing this? Why do they keep looking at this level that was clearly meant to be dark and unlit and go throw a flashbang into it? It is complete retardation that doesn't do anything to enhance the experience, and sterilizes what made this level so iconic. 343 Guilty Spark was groundbreaking by doing something that other games weren't doing at the time. It changed the genre of the game mid-playthrough and elevated the story into something beyond the usual sci-fi tropes. This doesn't do anything creative or new. It just copies what's already been done and makes it bland and flavorless. If it was trying to recreate the feeling of dread and suspense the original had, it fails miserably because of all the horrible changes they made to the visuals and aesthetic. This is basically how not to remake an iconic moment in video game history, where it does nothing but subtract from what was good about the original. It may be the same thing technically, but the crappy pacing, removal of the yellow dots, the terrible thinning of the fog, and the god-awful lighting and illumination covering every possible pixel makes it a thoroughly unfaithful adaptation of one of the greatest levels in gaming, in one of the greatest video games ever made. They really went with the old if it ain't broke, break it approach with this remake. I already knew it was gonna be lacking in all sorts of departments departments from the voice acting to the art direction, so I didn't think it was necessary to make a big video about something that everyone already figured out from the announcement of this game. But the reveal of the Flood from 343 Guilty Spark is an especially egregious example of how badly Halo Studios does not understand why the original Halo was so timeless, and why it remains a beloved cornerstone of gaming 25 years later. I shouldn't have to explain to people how this is not at all what the original level was like from a visual and aesthetic perspective. It doesn't matter if the gameplay is good or if the story is the same, the art direction was the most vital element to its legacy. All they did in the long run was make the level look more washed out and dated compared to the technology that was used for the original game. I really meant it when I said Microsoft is dead all those months ago. It's bad enough they turned their flagship series into a PlayStation title, but if this is their only idea for moving forward with Halo, just remaking an entire trilogy of games that's already perfect the way it is, especially when we already have the perfect collection of Halo games for a bargain deal on Steam, then they should really just go the way of Sega and become a third-party company. And anyone who actively defends this game is fucking stupid. Why would anyone want to play this version of Halo when it's literally the exact same thing, but with washed out visuals, generalized gameplay mechanics, awkward pacing as a result of the changes they made to cutscenes, worse voice acting, and less options for modding? Just do yourself a favor and skip this game. Just play Halo on Steam or the original Xbox, because there's literally nothing here that you can't get from just replaying the original. If anything, you'll get less out of it. And that's pretty much this whole game in a nutshell. More isn't just less in Halo Campaign Evolved. It's scarce of anything worth experiencing. And in a market where Microsoft is slowly dying, this is just rubbing plasma in a rotting wound.